Hello, Life Group leaders. We are on lesson 19 in Storing Through the Old Testament, and this lesson is about King Solomon and the dedication of the temple. It is great. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to read through all of chapters that it covers, which is, let me look here real quick, chapters 3 through 7. I just got through reading them myself, and they are really great to look and see how God blessed Israel and how the king decided to do everything that would magnify the name of the Lord in that temple. And so there are several really good questions for you to go over. There's a lot of questions in this one, but I just want to touch on a couple. Where did Solomon build a temple? Can you remember another story in which Mount Moriah was mentioned? What happened there? Obviously, from the second question, you know it was Mount Moriah. But the interesting thing about that mount is that is where God sent Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and where God provided the lamb for to be a substitute for Isaac there. And so it's a really important place in salvation history because sacrifice was offered there at the time of Abraham. Sacrifice would be offered there again with the Temple Mount. Second question is, what did the musicians sing about at the temple dedication? At least is the second question I'm covering. They sang about the goodness, they sang about the character of God. His goodness, for his steadfast love endures forever. They were talking about this covenant love that God had for Israel and how it was unending. And so, what did God do when they finished singing? The glory of the Lord fell on the place, and the whole house was filled with smoke to where they could not, or a cloud, where they could not continue their duties in the temple. And so the question is, do you think there's a connection between their praises and God's response? If so, what? I'm going to let you flesh that out. I'm going to give you one scripture verse. Psalm 22:3, God is enthroned in the praises of his people. I believe that is what we were created for, was to worship God. And whenever we fulfill the purpose for which he's given us, I believe he responds and blesses that. And he came down, and this is a manifestation of his presence. And so whenever you think about worship today, just to kind of flesh this out a little bit more, like how does God manifest himself as we worship him today? And so I'm not going to give you an answer. I'm going to let y'all talk through that. Another question, a few one down here, is, according to Solomon, what is the purpose of the temple? Did he think God could be contained in it? Well, it was a house dedicated to God, but obviously we can look, and it says in verse 18 of chapter 6, but will God indeed dwell with man on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? So Solomon understood that God would not be contained because he inhabits the whole universe. He understands the omnipresence of God, and so he did not think that God would be contained in that place. However, he wanted God to favor that place, to have his eyes toward it, which would mean he would always be looking toward it and showing favor to Israel. He wanted God to set his name there, which would be a sign that he had made covenant with the people, that they were his and he was theirs. And so, next question down, what did Solomon ask, or what kind of request did Solomon pray for the people of Israel? What did he ask God to do for them? Primarily forgiveness. I mean, if you work your way down, if man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath and comes and swears his oath before your altar in this house, then hear from heaven and act and judge your servants, repaying the guilty by bringing his conduct on his own head, and vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to his righteousness. Solomon wanted God to hear the requests and the prayers of the people and to act in response to those prayers. And so all the way down through here, Solomon is saying, if this happens and your people pray to you, respond accordingly, and primarily with forgiveness as we work down through there. Next question is, what did Solomon say about foreigners in his prayer? I think this is really, really important, because this is not just about the Israelite nation. Now, obviously, God is placing his presence there in Jerusalem and in this temple, and yet Solomon, in his prayer in the dedication of the temple, includes foreigners. He says, likewise, this is chapter 6, verse 32, likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people, Israel, comes from a far country for the sake of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays toward this house, hear from heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls you, in order that the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. And so he asks that the foreigner would come, whenever he comes and cries out to God, that God would hear him, and that God would respond to him for the glory of God's name. Because the goal is for God to be praised by all the peoples of the earth, all the nations of the earth. So this temple was being set up to let the glory of God be known throughout the earth. It's the original purpose that God had given Adam and Eve in the garden, to reflect his image, to have dominion over the earth, so that he would be known throughout the earth. It's the purpose he gave Israel all along, that he was gathering that people for himself, so that he would be made known among the nations, but for his steadfast love and kindness to this people. So all of this is for the glory of God's name. And so I just think it's really interesting in there that all the way through this, that you've got this continuing thread of God's glory among the nations. So next to last question, how did God respond to Solomon's prayer, and how did he show himself? What did the people do when they saw God's presence? He responded to Solomon's prayer in saying that he heard the prayer of Solomon, and that his presence would dwell there, and whenever his people would cry out to him and ask forgiveness, if they would humble themselves, that he would hear from heaven and he would heal them, heal their land. And so it's this famous prayer that we hear all the time in 2 Chronicles 7:14. But I think that's important too, that we don't take that in nationalistic terms for the United States. It's not the same thing. God is making this promise to his covenant people. The church is the covenant people of God, and so you can apply that to the church, but not necessarily to any other nation state. But the point is that God has responded in the affirmative, that he will dwell there, that he will hear their prayers, and that he will heal them. And so, but he also says that if they forsake him, that he will bring disaster upon them and he will scatter them. And so there's a response there. And so I think there's some other good questions in here, especially this one, this application, in light of the fact that Solomon would later disobey God and even worship at pagan altars. Why do you think God allowed him to be the one to build the temple? And what does this say about God's willingness to use imperfect people? First of all, I think we need to bring up the issue of perseverance. We have to continue to persevere in our faith. And, it's not necessarily always the way we start, but the way we finish. And so, but God did allow him to do this, and he was imperfect. And so God does use imperfect people, but that does not mean that we need to not persevere in our faith in him. This question's not in here, just one I think would be interesting to discuss. Why do we not still pray toward Jerusalem, towards where the temple was? I think you carry that over into the New Testament. Jesus talks about not even one stone will be left the temple, the destruction of the temple in Matthew. Um, you remember the woman at the well. God said, "There's a day coming, an hour, a day, an hour coming is even here when you will worship me in spirit, and people will worship me in spirit and in truth." And so, we now have the indwelling spirit. The presence of God dwelt in the temple, but now the veil has been torn because of the sacrifice of Jesus, and the presence of God now dwells in the hearts of his people. And so there's this restoration happening, that God is dwelling among his people again, just as he did, and he will do this and restore things perfectly as they were in the Garden of Eden, as we will be his people and he will be our God. And so there are still people that pray at the Wailing Wall. But we don't have to do that because we've got the indwelling spirit. And I think that's important to bring out as well. So I hope you have a great lesson. This is a great, great story of God setting up his people for the sake of his glory and for the sake of his name. And so I hope you enjoy it, and holler if you got any questions. Thanks.